You already know the one. A jet on the Hudson. Every soul saved. The pilot a hero. The world watched and called it a miracle. But here is what almost no one knows. It was not the first time, and it was not the last. Long before that winter morning in New York, and many times since, airliners full of people have come down on open water across the globe. The runway was right there in front of them, a strip of pavement reaching out from a Balinese beach into the bright tropical sea. Then a curtain of rain swept across the windscreen. The runway vanished, and in the space of a few seconds, Loganair Flight 904 went from an ordinary landing to a Boeing 737 floating in two pieces in the surf. By some miracle, every one of the 108 people aboard would climb out alive. But unlike so many water landings, this one was not forced by a dying engine or an empty tank. This jet was perfectly healthy. It flew into the sea because its pilots kept descending toward a runway they could no longer see. The flight was a routine domestic hop across Indonesia, from the city of Bandung to the holiday island of Bali, on an April afternoon. The airplane was nearly new and packed with vacationers, 101 passengers and 7 crew, most of them looking forward to a few days in paradise. The cabin crew had finished their final checks, the seatbelt signs were on, and there was nothing about the descent toward the seaside airport at Denpasar to suggest these people were minutes away from a crash. The only shadow on the afternoon was the weather. Rain showers were drifting across the coast, and the conditions over the airport were shifting from one minute to the next. The approach they were flying mattered a great deal to what came next. It was not the kind that offers a precise electronic beam to follow down to the runway. It was an older, simpler procedure, the sort that demands the pilots actually see the runway with their own eyes before they descend too low and break off the landing at once if they cannot. There is a hard floor built into approaches like this, a minimum altitude below which you do not go unless the runway is in sight. That floor exists for exactly the situation the crew was about to face. As the 737 came down the final approach, the first officer was at the controls, with the captain beside him watching for the runway ahead. Down they came toward the water, and as they neared that critical minimum height, around 900 feet, the first officer said aloud what he was seeing, or rather, what he was not seeing. The runway was not in sight. This was the moment the rules existed for. The correct response, the only safe response, was to push the throttles forward, climb away, and try the whole thing again. Instead, the captain announced that he could make out the approach lights somewhere ahead in the gloom, and told the younger pilot to continue. And so, fatefully, they kept going down. But whatever the captain thought he saw, it was not enough to land an airliner by, and the weather ahead was only thickening. As the jet sank through the last few hundred feet toward the sea, heavy rain began hammering the windscreen, loud enough to be picked up clearly on the cockpit recorder. The runway never came back into view, and now came the strangest and most revealing moment of the whole sequence. At barely 150 feet above the water, with the airplane already far too low and still sinking, the captain reached over and took the controls away from the first officer, the younger man acknowledged, and then added with quiet honesty that he still could not see the runway. The truth was that neither of them could. They were now hand-flying a jet airliner through cloud and rain with nothing to see outside, and no electronic path to guide them down, which is very nearly the most dangerous place a pilot can be. And the airplane was rapidly running out of room between itself and the waves. For a few more seconds, it kept descending, the sea rising silently to meet it. Then, impossibly late, the captain finally called for a go-around and shoved the engines up toward full power to climb away. But a heavy jet does not stop descending the instant the engines spool up. It needs height and time to arrest its fall and begin to climb, and the 737 had neither. Barely a second after the go-around was called, the airplane hit the sea. It struck the water just short of the runway threshold, only a few hundred meters off the beach, with enough force to break the fuselage cleanly into two pieces. The sea rushed into the cabin, and yet the very thing that should have doomed them turned out to be their salvation. The jet had come down relatively flat and slow, into shallow water close to the shore, rather than plunging into the deep. It did not sink away beneath them. Passengers climbed out through the breaks in the fuselage, and the emergency exits into water that was, in places, shallow enough to stand in. Local boats and rescuers were on the scene within minutes. 46 people were hurt, 4 of them seriously, but against every expectation, not a single person died. The images of the broken jet sitting in the calm surf, its passengers safely ashore on a tropical beach, traveled around the world within hours. When investigators pieced it together, their verdict was blunt. The airplane had suffered no mechanical fault of any kind. It had simply been flown below its safe limit and onward toward a runway the crew could not see. at the precise moment when every rule demanded they abandon the approach and climb. The weather had turned faster than anyone on the ground had warned them, and once the rain swallowed the runway, the pilots lost their grip on where they actually were. The captain's instinct to seize the controls and rescue the landing himself had come far too late to rescue anything but their lives. In the end, the only thing standing between Loganair Flight 904 and a true catastrophe was the soft, shallow water of a Balinese beach. On the weather radar, it looked like a doorway, two angry red storm cells, and between them, a clear green gap just wide enough to slip through. The captain of Garuda, Indonesia, Flight 421, had threaded gaps like this 1,000 times in his long career flying Indonesia's stormy skies. But this gap was a lie, and flying into it would lead to one of the most violent few minutes any airline crew has ever survived, and a landing on a river that should never have been possible. The flight was a short domestic hop across the island of Java on a January afternoon, a Boeing 737 barely half full with 60 people aboard. In command was one of the airline's most senior and respected pilots, a man who had risen from selling fruit on the streets of Jakarta to 14,000 hours in the cockpit. As they descended toward their destination, a towering wall of thunderstorms rose across their path, climbing higher than 10 miles into the sky. There was no going over it. The only way through was to find a weak spot between the cells, and the radar seemed to show one straight ahead. What the radar could not show was that the gap was an illusion. The rain inside one of those storms was so dense that it bounced the radar beam straight back, leaving a dark, empty-looking shadow behind it. To the pilots, that shadow looked like clear air. It was, in fact, the heart of the storm. The moment the 737 flew into it, the false gap vanished into a sea of red, and the airplane was swallowed whole. Torrential rain and hailstones by the thousands hammered the fuselage so loudly the pilots could barely hear each other shout. Violent winds threw the jet up and down and sideways. This was, investigators later said, very likely the most intense precipitation ever recorded from inside an airplane. The engines, built to swallow almost any storm on Earth, simply could not cope with this one. So much water and ice poured into them that they could no longer burn fuel, and within 90 seconds of entering the storm, both engines flamed out at once. Now the situation spiraled fast. With the engines dead, the airplane began losing electrical power, and the crew's attempts to restart drained a battery that, unknown to them, had been quietly failing for months. When they tried to bring the backup generator online, the last of the power collapsed. The instrument panels went dark. The radios died mid-Mayday call. The flight controls stiffened into dead weight with no hydraulic help. In an instant, the crew was left with almost nothing, holding a powerless, near-blind jet level as it fell through the storm at 4,000 feet a minute, with no way to call for help and no idea what lay below. Then, at 8,000 feet, the airplane burst out of the clouds, and the rain stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The pilots now had less than 2 minutes to find somewhere to land. Below them stretched an endless plain of rice paddies, soft and useless for a landing. But slicing through it was one narrow ribbon of water, the Bengawan Solo River, barely twice as wide as the airplane's wingspan and lined with trees. It was the only option. Hauling on the heavy manual controls, the captain forced the crippled jet through a desperate turn to line up with the one straight stretch he could find, a length of river hemmed in between two bridges. He brought it down with extraordinary skill. The jet skimmed over the first bridge, slowed, and slammed into the shallow water. The tail struck the rocky riverbed and was torn away, killing one flight attendant in the back. But the rest of the airplane shuddered to a halt against the bank, broken but largely intact. Of the 60 people aboard, 59 survived. Fishermen and villagers waded out to carry the injured ashore and drove them to hospital in their own cars. The investigation found the engines were never truly broken, and the airplane should not have needed saving at all. The crew had flown into that storm only because their radar showed a gap that was not real, a trap they had never been trained to recognize. They paid for it with the most harrowing ride imaginable. But against terrible odds, a pilot who started his life selling fruit on a city street turned a dead jet and a sliver of river into 59 lives saved. There was a perfectly good engine on this airplane the whole time. It sat there, idling quietly, ready to deliver all the power the crew so desperately needed, while the two pilots argued about temperatures and altitudes and slowly flew their cargo jet into the sea. Nobody thought to push its throttle forward. That single oversight on a dark night off the coast of Hawaii turned a minor engine problem into a ditching in the Black Pacific, one that very nearly killed them both. The flight was a late-night cargo run between the Hawaiian Islands, departing Honolulu just after 1 in the morning. The airplane was an ancient Boeing 737, a freighter built back in the 1970s, loaded that night with frozen seafood and other perishables. The two pilots flew for a small, scrappy local cargo outfit that operated some of the oldest jets still flying in America. Neither man knew it, but inside the right engine, decades of corrosion had been quietly eating away at the turbine blades, and on this takeoff, one of them finally let go. Seconds after the wheels left the runway, there was a loud thud and a shudder, and the right engine rolled back, losing much of its power. The pilots reacted correctly at first. They both identified the failure right away as the number 2, the right engine, and the first officer pressed the rudder to keep the airplane straight. This should have been an entirely survivable situation. The airplane could fly perfectly well on one engine, and all they had to do was climb to a safe height, sort out the problem calmly, and bring it back to land. The captain told the controller they had an emergency and turned to deal with it. But, from there, things began to unravel in slow motion. The captain spent nearly 2 full minutes wrestling with a busy controller who kept missing his emergency calls, his attention pulled away from the cockpit at the worst possible time. Meanwhile, to slow the airplane down, the first officer pulled both throttles all the way back to idle, including the throttle of the good left engine. And here the trap was set. With both engines now idling, the airplane no longer pulled to one side, and the most obvious clue to which engine had failed simply vanished. When the two pilots finally turned together to identify the broken engine, several minutes had passed, and their memories had betrayed them. The first officer now declared, with complete confidence, that it was the left engine that had failed. He was wrong. He had even set that engine to idle with his own hand minutes earlier, yet somehow he had forgotten, and the captain, trusting his colleague, accepted the verdict without checking it. From that moment, both men believed their only working engine was the right one, the very engine that was actually damaged. So the captain nursed the damaged right engine, pushing it harder and harder to stay in the air, while the healthy left engine sat untouched at idle beside it. The right engine, already broken, began to overheat alarmingly, its temperature climbing into the red. To the crew, this looked like a second engine slowly dying, the start of a total catastrophe. In reality, they were leaning on their bad engine and ignoring their good one. The airplane, with only one straining half-power engine to hold it up, could not maintain altitude. Slowly, relentlessly, it began to sink toward the ocean. What followed was a long, agonizing descent in the dark, the cockpit filling with alarms. The ground proximity system screamed at them to climb. The stall warning rattled. The pilots, now gripped by tunnel vision, were so consumed with the struggle to keep the airplane flying that neither of them ever glanced at the left throttle, still sitting at idle, holding back all the power that could have saved them. One simple push, and they would have flown away. It never occurred to either of them. But the captain did make one decision that would prove crucial. He told the controller to alert the Coast Guard, because he no longer believed they would reach the airport. They did not. With the city lights still far off across the water, the 737 sank the last few hundred feet, and despite everything the pilots did, it struck the surface of Mamala Bay more than 3 kilometers offshore. The impact cracked the fuselage in two, and the sea poured in. Both pilots, battered and with the cockpit flooding around them, managed to force their windows open and haul themselves out into the heaving black water as the airplane began to sink beneath them. What saved them was the captain's call for help. A Coast Guard helicopter was already roaring overhead within minutes, its floodlights sweeping the waves. One of the men clung to the sinking tail, the other to a floating cargo pallet, and as the captain began to slip under, swallowing water and fuel, a rescue swimmer leapt from the helicopter and pulled him back from the edge of death. The swimmer then went straight back into the sea for the first officer, guiding him to a rescue boat. Against every odd, 2 men who had ditched a jet in the open ocean in the dead of night were both pulled out alive. When investigators raised the wreckage months later and listened to the recordings, the truth was almost painful. The airplane had suffered only a partial failure of one engine, a problem it could easily have survived. It came down in the sea because a healthy engine was left idling and forgotten, its power never used, while 2 stressed and confused pilots flew a flyable airplane into the water. They survived their mistake by the narrowest of margins. The lesson, written in saltwater and corrosion, was an old one. Before you fight to save an airplane, make certain you know which part of it has actually failed. It began with a problem so small, it should have been almost nothing. As Aeroflot Flight 366 climbed away from Tallinn on a summer morning in 1963, bound for Moscow, the nose wheel refused to fold up into the airplane. A single detached bolt had jammed it. On its own, a stuck nose wheel is not a catastrophe. But over the next 2 hours, That tiny fault would set off a chain of events that ended with a passenger jet gliding silently over one of the world's great cities and landing on a river in front of a stunned crowd, decades before anyone had heard the phrase "miracle on the water." The airplane was a Soviet jet, a Tupolev, only a year old and carrying 52 people. With the nose gear stuck and thick fog now blanketing the airport behind them, the crew could not go back. They were sent on instead to Leningrad, the city we now call St. Petersburg. There, the plan was sound enough. The airport readied a soft dirt runway to cushion a landing on a jammed wheel, and the jet began circling over the city to burn off its heavy load of fuel, which would lower the risk of fire when it came down. Round and round it went, for over an hour, while inside the cabin, the crew even tried to force the stubborn wheel into place, with a pole pulled from a closet. And here, the small problem turned into a deadly one. The airplane's fuel gauges were faulty, and they had been telling the crew a comforting lie. There was far less fuel left than the needles showed. On what should have been one of its final circuits, with the airport about 12 miles away, the left engine abruptly fell silent. It had been starved of fuel. Moments later, as the jet passed directly over the heart of the old city, the second engine died too. In an instant, the crew had no power at all, too low to glide to the airport, with a dense and historic city sprawling beneath them, and nowhere solid to land. There was only one place to go. Cutting straight through the city was the Neva River, broad and gray, and the captain made the only choice left to him. He would land on the water, with both engines dead, and only the wind over the wings to guide him. He glided the silent airliner down toward the river, threading it through the very center of Leningrad. He cleared one great steel bridge with barely 100 feet to spare, then scraped over a second bridge still under construction, missing it by a whisker. Then, with extraordinary delicacy, he set the powerless jet down on the surface of the Neva. The landing was so smooth that at first it almost worked perfectly, but as the jet settled into the water, its fuselage cracked open and the river began pouring in. The airplane was sinking. By sheer good fortune, a small tugboat was passing close by. Its skipper later admitted he assumed he was watching a test of some new kind of seaplane, and he swung his vessel toward the stricken jet. The crew got a line across, and the tug hauled the airliner toward the riverbank as the passengers scrambled out, some of them climbing through the cockpit windows as the water rose. Every one of the 52 people aboard made it out alive. Not a single person was seriously hurt. What happened on the Neva that day was, in almost every way, the same feat the world would celebrate over New York nearly half a century later. A crew robbed of both engines, with a city below and no runway in reach, chose a river, and brought everyone home. The difference is that almost no one outside the Soviet Union ever heard about it. The cause was a sad and avoidable one, a maintenance slip and a set of lying fuel gauges that left a sound airplane empty over a city. But the ending belonged to the pilots, who turned a powerless jet and a 1,000-foot ribbon of water into 52-second chances. Every water landing in this story so far has ended with people walking away. This one did not. On a freezing winter evening over Scotland, a small cargo plane lost both its engines in the climb, came down in the dark waters of the Firth of Forth, and broke apart on impact. Its two pilots, the only souls aboard, never escaped the cockpit. And the cruelest part of all is that when investigators pulled the engines from the sea, they could find nothing wrong with them. The machines that had killed the crew were, by every measurable standard, in perfect working order. The airplane was a short 360, a boxy little turboprop stripped of its seats and pressed into service hauling mail and freight around the United Kingdom. On this night, it was due to fly a short run from Edinburgh across to Belfast, but the weather had thrown the whole day into chaos. A bitter wind out of the north drove freezing temperatures and blowing snow across the airport, and the flight was delayed again and again. The airplane left parked out on the ramp for some 17 hours, while crews waited for the storm to pass and the airport to reopen. In that long, frozen wait, the seeds of disaster were quietly sown in a place no one could see. This particular type of engine drew its air through an intake at the front, then routed it through a sharp bend and up into a chamber wrapped around the back of the engine. Hour after hour, with the airplane pointed straight into the wind, fine snow blew in through the open intakes and gathered deep inside, in the top of that hidden chamber. There was a simple defense against this, a set of covers called bungs that plug the engine intakes when a plane is parked, but the bungs were kept at the airline's other bases, not here, and there were none to be had at Edinburgh. So the engines sat open to the storm, slowly filling with snow. When the crew finally ran the engines that afternoon, the snow packed inside began to melt into slush, slide down toward that sharp bend in the ducting, and refreeze in the chill air, settling into a hidden pile right where it could do the most harm. Nothing about this was visible to the pilots. it would not have shown up on any normal inspection. The airplane looked perfectly clean and ready to fly. At last, more than 16 hours behind schedule, the short 360 rumbled down the runway and lifted off into the night, climbing out over the water. Everything was normal. The engines pulled strongly. The pilots ran through their after-takeoff checklist, and because they expected to meet icing in the clouds ahead, the captain decided to switch on all the anti-icing systems as a precaution. The first officer reached down and flipped the switches for the engine anti-ice. It was the most sensible decision he could have made, and it killed them both. Those switches opened a set of vanes inside the engine intakes, and as the vanes swung open, they shoved that hidden pile of slush forward into the narrowest part of the duct, choking off the airflow almost completely. 4 seconds later, both engines flamed out at the same instant. One moment, the crew had 2 healthy engines. The next, in the climb, in the dark, over freezing water, they had none. The captain heard the noise die away, and at first thought his young first officer had made some mistake. Asked what he had done, the first officer could only answer, nothing, and he was right. There was no time to puzzle it out. The airplane had reached barely 2,600 feet and was already sinking, with less than a minute of flight left in it. The first officer called out a mayday, reporting a double engine failure, while the captain searched desperately for anywhere to put the airplane down. He could not turn back to the airport, which lay into the wind and behind rising ground. Ahead was only the cold water of the firth, and beyond it, a shoreline cluttered with trees and houses and hills. The one possible refuge was a short strip of grass in a park along the shore, and he aimed for it with everything he had. He very nearly made it. Fighting to stretch the glide, he held the airplane on the very edge of a stall, nose high, speed bleeding away, coaxing it toward the grass. But the distance was just too great. With the shore agonizingly close, only about 65 meters away, the short 360 struck the heaving waves. It hit a swell so hard that it broke in two, and the forward section, with both pilots inside, pitched over and drove straight down into the muddy seabed. Rescuers raced to the scene, but by the time a boat reached the wreck, there was nothing to be done. The water was only a few degrees above freezing, cold enough to steal the breath from a body on contact, and in all likelihood, neither man was able to escape before the freezing sea took him. The investigation slowly uncovered the chain of small failures behind it all. The missing intake covers, the snow no one could see, a checklist that never told the crew to switch on a system that might have relit the engines in time. The captain, they concluded, had done everything right in his final minute, choosing correctly to look for a landing spot rather than fight to restart engines that would not come back. He flew a dying airplane about as well as it could be flown, but the water was too rough, the shore was too far, and his luck had run out. Of all the water landings in this story, Loganair Flight 670 Alpha is the reminder that skill and good judgment are sometimes simply not enough. Most people who ditch into the sea do it within sight of land, with rescue close at hand. The passengers of ALM Flight 980 had no such luck. When their jet finally ran dry, it came down on the open Caribbean more than 50 kilometers from the nearest island, into a storm with waves the height of a house. What followed was not a quick rescue, but a brutal 90-minute battle for survival. The airplane itself had no fault at all. It simply ran out of fuel, because of a string of decisions that tightened around the crew like a noose. It was the 2nd of May, 1970. A new service from New York down to the little Caribbean island of Sint Maarten, flown with a leased DC-9. The problem was hidden in plain sight from the start. The island's airport had a notoriously short runway, hemmed in by water, and the distance from New York sat right at the ragged edge of how far this jet could fly. The flight south was routine until the weather turned. Thunderstorms forced the crew to slow, descend, and weave around the worst of them, quietly burning through their reserves. Then, as they neared the island, came the news every pilot dreads. The airport was reporting visibility below the limit for a safe landing. The captain turned away toward an alternate, the cautious choice, but minutes later the island called back to say the weather had improved just enough, and so, fatefully, he turned around again and went for it. What the crew could not know was that a wall of heavy rain sat directly over the approach, hiding the runway at the exact moment they needed to see it. The airport had no modern system to guide them through the murk. They had to find the runway with their own eyes and swing the jet onto it by hand at the last second. On the first approach, the rain swallowed the runway, and the captain rolled out misaligned, forced to climb away. He should have quit then and flown to his alternate. He did not. He tried a second time and lost the runway again. And then, unbelievably, a third time, each circuit eating away the fuel he no longer had to spare. By the time he finally turned for the nearest alternate, it was far too late. The fuel needles were bouncing down towards zero. The captain asked air traffic control for the distance to one island, then another, then a third, and the answer was always the same. Everywhere was too far. They were going into the water. Now he faced a challenge almost no airline pilot ever trains for, landing a jet on the open ocean in towering swells and driving rain. Word was passed to prepare the cabin, but a muddled message and a broken public address system meant no clear warning ever reached the passengers. Many were still struggling into their life vests when the captain made his final call. The impact was savage, stopping the jet in a distance shorter than its own length. Seats tore loose, belts snapped, and the sea came pouring in. The airplane stayed afloat for only about 10 minutes before it slipped beneath the waves forever, taking with it everyone who had not gotten out. The survivors were left scattered across the storm, clinging to a single escape slide. Rescue was 50 kilometers away, and the first helicopter took 90 minutes to fight its way out to them. One by one, over hours, the exhausted survivors were hauled from the sea, the last of them more than 2.5 hours after the crash. Of the 63 people aboard, 40 survived. The investigation found the jet had been perfectly capable of completing the flight. It crashed because the crew kept trying to land at an airport that would not let them, with no plan for what to do when the fuel ran low, until the choice was made for them. The captain, who brought a doomed jet down onto a raging ocean and lived, never denied his part in it. Told later that his passengers had praised his beautiful landing, he answered simply, "Not beautiful enough. People were lost." When the engines fall silent, or the runway slips away into the fog, and there is nothing solid left within reach, a pilot is faced with the one landing almost none of them ever truly trained for: putting an airliner down on water. It is, in many ways, the hardest thing a crew can be asked to do, and the most frightening. And yet, as these stories show, it is not always the end. What stays with you, looking back across all of them, is how thin the line really is. The water does not care how skilled the pilot is. The same maneuver that saved 52 people on a river in Leningrad and 107 in a calm gray bay took the lives of 2 pilots in a freezing Scottish firth, simply because the sea that day was rough and the shore was a few hundred meters too far, a gentle swell or a savage one, a tide running high or low, a lagoon a few degrees warmer than a winter sea. Over and over, the difference between a miracle and a tragedy came down not to the courage in the cockpit, but to the mood of the water waiting below. And there is something else these crews shared, something easy to miss. In almost every case, the airplane did not have to end up in the water at all. A storm flown into instead of around, a gap on the radar that was never really there, a healthy engine left quietly idling, a runway chased downward long after it should have been abandoned. The sea was rarely the first mistake. It was the place where a chain of smaller mistakes finally came due. The water was not the villain of these stories. It was the last page. But it would be wrong to end on despair, because the overwhelming lesson of these 8 landings is a hopeful one. Coming down on water, the thing passengers fear most when they glance out at the ocean below, is survivable. It has been survived again and again in rivers and lagoons and bays, and even the open sea. Airplanes are stronger than they look, water is more forgiving than we imagine, and human beings are capable of extraordinary calm in the worst moments of their lives. The most famous water landing of all, the one on the Hudson that the whole world remembers, was not a freak of nature that could never be repeated. It was the latest chapter in a long, quiet history of crews who looked down at the water with no other option and brought their people home anyway. So the next time your flight crosses a wide stretch of ocean and you find yourself staring down at all that water, you might think of these stories, not with fear, but with a strange kind of comfort, because every one of them is proof that even there, even with everything gone wrong and nowhere left to land, survival is possible. The people in these airplanes faced the very situation we quietly dread at 30,000 feet, and most of them lived to tell the tale. They were ordinary travelers and working crews who met an extraordinary moment, far from any runway, with only water beneath them. Remembering what happened to them is how we honor the ones who did not make it, and how we keep faith with the ones who did. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, consider subscribing to Terra Obscura.